The moment Clement Wells saw Harlan Prute slide Pearl Keller's cameo brooch across the counter of his general store, the world tilted on its axis in a way that no amount of hard living had ever managed. He recognized it instantly. How could he not? He had watched that brooch catch the afternoon light 100 times when Pearl stood on her porch scanning the horizon, one hand lifted to shade her eyes, the ivory cameo pinned just below her collar like a small, quiet declaration of dignity. It was the last beautiful thing she owned. He knew that without anyone having to tell him, the way a man knows things about a woman he has been watching from a careful distance for the better part of 2 years, learning the shape of her grief the same way he had learned the shape of the land his cattle roamed. Where did this come from? He heard himself ask, his voice coming out lower and harder than he intended. Harlan Prute, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the perpetual expression of someone calculating profit margins, looked up from the ledger he was writing in. "Widow Keller brought it in this morning," he said, not bothering to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "Settled her seed bill with it. That corn she ordered, the wheat, the whole spring order, cleaned her out entirely." He held the brooch up to the light filtering through the store's dusty window. "Pretty piece. Italian work, I'd wager. Worth more than the bill she owed, honestly, but she didn't argue the price." Something cold and sharp moved through Clement's chest. She had not argued the price. Pearl Keller, who argued about everything with a quiet, iron-spined precision that he had always privately admired, had not argued the price for her last piece of jewelry. That meant she was desperate in a way she could not afford for anyone to see. He took a breath, then another. He set down the bag of fence nails he had come to purchase and he said, very carefully, "How much was the bill?" Harlan blinked. "That's between me and Mrs. Keller." "How much, Harlan?" There was something in the way he said it that made Harlan Prute's bookkeeper instincts override his stubborn ones. "$4.60, he said. "Feed corn, winter wheat, some clover seed. She put in the order back in February when she still had the..." He stopped himself. "Well, it doesn't matter what she had then. $4.60. For that, she had given up the last piece of her former life. The last piece of her mother, probably. The last thing she had refused to sell through 2 brutal winters and 1 devastating drought." Clement Wells put his hand flat on the counter and stared at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the cameo brooch and set $4.60 beside Harlan Prute's ledger and said, "I'll take it." He walked out of the general store into the white heat of the Kansas morning and stood in the street with Pearl Keller's brooch in his closed fist. And he understood, with sudden terrible clarity, that he was in love with a woman who had never once asked him for anything at all. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to go back to the spring of 1878, to the day Pearl Keller arrived in Caldwell, Kansas with a wagon full of determination and almost nothing else. She had come from St. Louis, and before that from a family of modest means that had tried very hard to pretend otherwise. Her father had been a schoolteacher who invested badly. Her mother had been a woman of exquisite taste and no financial sense whatsoever. By the time Pearl was 19, they were gone, both of them, her mother to a fever and her father to the kind of slow collapse that some men fall into when the thing they built their identity around turns to dust. Pearl had taken what was left, which was not much, and she had married Thomas Keller, who was 10 years her senior and had 160 acres in the Cherokee Strip under the Homestead Act, and a personality that managed to be simultaneously optimistic and deeply careless. Thomas Keller was not a bad man. She had told herself that many times in the years since. He was simply not a careful one. He took risks the way other men took breaths, naturally and without particular thought. Some of those risks paid off, more of them did not. He died in the fall of 1876, thrown from a horse on a morning when Pearl had asked him to fix the porch step first, and she had spent the better part of 2 years refusing to let that coincidence become something she blamed herself for. What Thomas left her was the land. 160 acres of Kansas prairie that she did not fully know how to work, a house that needed more repairs than she could afford, and a debt to the bank in Caldwell that required very careful management. What he also left her, though he had not meant to, was a ferocious education in survival. Pearl Keller in her first year alone learned more about farming, carpentry, livestock management, water conservation, and the particular politics of borrowing money from men who did not believe women should be doing what she was doing than most people learn in a decade. She was 24 years old, and she was made of something that most people in Caldwell could not quite name. They respected her, in the way that communities sometimes respect people who refuse to be defeated, which is to say with a complicated mixture of admiration and discomfort. Clement Wells had come to Caldwell 3 months after Pearl, though he had been passing through the region for years before that. He was 31, the son of a Texas ranching family that had made and lost and remade its fortune with the same cyclical violence as the weather that governed that part of the country. He had driven cattle up the Kisham Trail 4 times by the time he was 25. He had seen the open range begin its slow transformation into something fenced and complicated. He had watched the world he understood shift beneath his boots like sand. And so he had done what seemed logical to a man of his practical temperament. He had purchased land outside Caldwell, built a modest but solid house, acquired a cattle herd of 300 head, and hired 3 good men to help him run it. He was not, by any conventional measure, a man given to romantic feeling. His ranch foreman, a laconic Mexican-American named Rodrigo Esperanza, would have laughed himself hoarse at the suggestion that Clement Wells had a tender bone in his body. Clement was competent. He was fair. He kept his word. He paid on time. He did not drink to excess or gamble beyond his means or involve himself in other people's difficulties. Until Pearl Keller, he had been extremely good at that last one. He had first spoken to her at the Mercantile in October of 1877, 6 months after she arrived. She had been standing in the street outside Pruett's store, arguing with the delivery man about a crate of glass that had arrived broken. The delivery man was twice her size and appeared accustomed to winning arguments through volume alone. Pearl was not raising her voice. She was, instead, speaking in a tone of such precise, calm, devastating clarity that the delivery man was visibly shrinking while she remained absolutely still. "The glass arrived broken," she said, for what appeared to be the 3rd time, with the patience of someone explaining mathematics to a very slow student. "You will either replace it or you will refund the cost. These are the only 2 options available to you. The fact that you are unhappy about this does not constitute a 3rd option." Clement had stopped walking. He had stood on the boardwalk across the street and watched her dismantle the delivery man's resistance with nothing but clear language and absolute conviction, and he had thought, with a clarity that surprised him, there is a woman who has been managing things alone for a very long time. After that, he found himself paying attention in ways that were not entirely deliberate. Her property was 3 miles from his, close enough that their fences shared a section line. He rode past that fence more often than strict necessity required. He noticed when her roof was patched with new timber. He noticed when one of her 2 horses went lame and she was pulling her own water from the well for a month. He noticed the way the soil on her property changed from one season to the next, the evidence of her learning written in the land itself. He had helped her exactly twice, and both times he had done it in ways she would not know to attribute to him. He had spoken quietly to Sam Holder at the feed store about extending her credit one particularly bad month. He had sent Rodrigo to fix her fence line after a storm, telling him to say only that neighboring ranchers had agreed to share repair labor that season, which was not entirely untrue. He had not spoken to her directly about any of it because Pearl Keller had a dark past with charity. That was what people whispered, though they got the details wrong. What was actually true was that she had learned, through very specific and painful experience, that offers of help in this community often came wrapped around hidden motives. Men who offered to help a young widow with her land tended to have ideas about what that help entitled them to. She had dealt with several of those situations with the same quiet, devastating precision she brought to everything, but it had cost her something, some softness, some willingness to be vulnerable. She was not unfriendly, but she kept her own counsel and she kept her own distance, and Clement respected that even when it frustrated him. He had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in 2 years, always in town, always in the context of ordinary business. She knew he was her neighbor. She thanked him once for the fence work, because she had clearly seen through the story about shared labor and was not going to pretend otherwise. He had said it was no trouble. She had looked at him with those clear gray eyes of hers and said, very quietly, "I appreciate it, Mr. Wells, and I hope you understand that I would prefer to manage my own affairs going forward." He had respected that. He had also, in the privacy of his own considerable stubbornness, decided that respecting it did not mean he was indifferent to her welfare. And now, standing in the street with her cameo brooch in his fist and $4.60 gone from his pocket, he had crossed a line that was going to require some very careful navigation. He spent the rest of that day thinking about it. He drove his wagon home, unloaded the fence nails he had actually come to buy, checked on his cattle, discussed a problem with a section of the north pasture with Rodrigo, ate supper, and sat on his porch in the evening dark thinking about what it meant that Pearl Keller had sold the last thing she loved to pay for the seeds that might save her farm. It meant the bank debt was worse than he had thought. It meant she was making a forced choice, the kind where there are no good options and you simply pick the one that keeps you breathing. It meant that if the spring planting failed for any reason, she was finished. He turned the brooch over in his fingers. The cameo was a woman's profile, carved in pale relief against a darker background, the kind of work that had been fashionable in the years before the war and had become something people held onto because it was a different world that had made it. A woman's face, serene and permanent. He wondered who it had belonged to before Pearl. Her mother, almost certainly. The brooch had that quality of a thing carried across generations, handled often enough that it held warmth. The next morning he rode to town. He arrived at Pruett's store before it opened and waited on the bench outside. When Harlan Pruett came to unlock the door and saw Clement sitting there, he had the look of a man who had been half expecting something but was not sure what. "I need to know the full extent of Pearl Keller's account with you," Clement said. "That is absolutely not your business, Clement." "I'm making it my business." Harlan stared at him for a long moment. Then, with the pragmatic instinct of a man who understood that the wealthiest cattle rancher in the county had a certain gravitational pull on commercial relationships, he sighed. "She's current as of yesterday. The seed bill was the last outstanding item. She has no credit remaining, but she has no debt to me either." "What about the bank? Now that is really not my—" Harlan. Another pause. "I hear things," Harlan said carefully, "the same way you hear things, and what I hear is that Thomas Keller's original mortgage has been refinanced twice and the current rate is not kind. I hear that she has made every payment but that doing so has left very little margin. I hear that if this year's crop fails, the bank will move to foreclose." Clement nodded slowly. "And if this year's crop succeeds? If she gets a good yield on what she planted and the prices hold, she might have enough to begin paying down the principal. It would still be years, but it would be possible." He thanked Harlan and rode home. He spent that afternoon doing calculations on a piece of paper at his kitchen table, the kind of calculations that involved land values and crop yields and market prices and debt schedules. He had grown up around ranching finance. He understood numbers, and the numbers told him that Pearl's situation was not hopeless, but it was fragile in a way that required everything to go exactly right. He thought about what he could do. The obvious answer was also the impossible one. He could pay off her debt. He had the money. Thomas Keller's mortgage, even at the refinanced rate, was not going to break him. He could walk into the First National Bank of Caldwell, speak to the manager, and arrange it in an afternoon. And Pearl Keller would find out within 48 hours, because this was a small community and secrets did not keep, and she would be furious in a way that would incinerate whatever tentative goodwill existed between them. She would not see a gift. She would see a trap. She would see a hidden motive. She would see a man trying to put her in a position of obligation, and she would be right to see it that way, because there was no gift of that magnitude that did not carry weight. So he could not do that. But there were other things. He spent 3 days thinking before he rode to her property on a Thursday morning in late April. The sky was the particular sharp blue of Kansas spring, and the prairie grass was coming up green along the roadsides, and the plowing she had done was visible from the road, long straight furrows running east to west across her best field. She had planted already, or was planting. She had not wasted any time. He found her on her knees in the near field, doing something with her hands in the soil that resolved into depositing seed at careful intervals as he got closer. She was wearing a blue work dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone pale and soft, and a wide straw hat, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot. She heard his horse and looked up, shading her eyes, and he watched the particular calibration happen in her expression. Recognition, reserve, a careful neutrality that was not unfriendliness but was not openness either. "Mr. Wells," she said. She stayed kneeling. "Mrs. Keller." He dismounted and stood a respectful distance away. "I don't want to interrupt your planting. I'll be brief." "Please do," she said, which from another person might have been rude but from her was simply honest. "I have a proposition that I believe would benefit us both," he said, "and I want to be clear from the outset that I am not offering charity. This is a business arrangement with a mutual advantage." She looked at him with those gray eyes that had a quality of looking straight through things. "Go on," she said. "I need water rights for the summer grazing season. The creek that runs through my south pasture has been running low for 2 years. Your property has the better access to the main branch, and if I could run a pipeline across the northeast corner of your land, I could water my south herd without losing 3 hours of driving time every day." This was true. It was one of those things he had thought about for 2 years without ever quite getting around to addressing. "I would pay you a reasonable easement fee for the summer season. I'm suggesting $6, which is a fair market rate." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He could see her working through it, looking for the hidden motive, the trap in the proposition. $6, she said. "For the summer season, May through September. We would put it in writing." She was quiet for a long moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass, very bright and clear. "And next year," she said. "We negotiate next year when next year comes. The arrangement is season by season." Another silence. He could see the reluctance in her, the deeply instilled caution, the refusal to be beholden. But he could also see the arithmetic happening in her eyes, and the arithmetic was not lying to her. $6 was $6. It was meaningful. It was also, crucially, a payment for something real that she actually possessed, which meant she was not receiving charity. She was conducting business. "You'll want to look at the corner section," she said finally, standing up and brushing the soil from her knees, "to see where the pipeline would run." "I would," he said. They walked the northeast corner of her property together, and he was struck, as he always was, by how thoroughly she knew her own land. She could point to the drainage patterns without looking at them. She knew where the soil was rocky and where it would give. She talked about the water levels she had observed since she arrived with a precision that reminded him of cattlemen twice her age. He found himself saying so. She glanced at him sideways. "I had to learn fast," she said simply. "You learned well." She did not respond to the compliment directly, but something in her bearing shifted very slightly, like a door opening an inch. He did not push it. They agreed on the easement. She signed the paper he had brought in his coat pocket, and he paid her the $6 on the spot in coin, because he had also thought about that, about how cash in hand meant more than any promise. She folded the bills carefully and put them in her pocket with the matter-of-fact grace of a woman who had learned not to treat money with anything other than seriousness. He rode home feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, which was hope. Not for her situation, though that too, but for the possibility that there was a path forward here that did not require him to either do nothing or overwhelm her with something she could not accept. Over the next 3 weeks, the water pipeline project gave him legitimate reasons to visit her property with his hired hands, and Pearl Keller gave him something more valuable than she knew, which was the opportunity to simply be in proximity to her long enough for the careful distance between them to begin, slowly, to close. He noticed things. She was reading at night. He could see the lamp in her window when he drove home late from the south pasture. She was reading seriously, not novels, but agricultural journals and the farm almanac and anything practical she could find. She had a kitchen garden behind the house that was the most organized thing he had ever seen, every plant labeled with small wooden markers in handwriting so neat it looked printed. He noticed that she did not eat enough. He could see it in her face, the fine line of privation that was separate from thinness, the way a person's eyes look when they are stretching every resource. He noticed that her horse, the one that had not gone lame, was getting the best of what little she had for feed. She was taking care of the horse before herself. He told Rodrigo to tell the cook to double the portions of the noon meal when they were working on the pipeline. "We're in the field all day," he said. "People need to eat," and he made sure that there was always more than what 4 men could reasonably consume, and that some of it ended up on Pearl Keller's porch with a note that said only "excess from noon meal. Waste is a sin." He did not sign it, but he suspected she knew. The 3rd time this happened, she came out to the field where they were working with a jar of dried apple preserves that she had clearly made herself and set it on the fence post. She did not say anything about the food. She said, "I thought you might want something sweet with the noon meal," and she walked back to her own planting before he could answer. Rodrigo watched this exchange with tremendous interest and the careful blankness of a man who knew better than to comment on his employer's personal life while on the clock. Later, riding home, he said, "She is very proud." "Yes," Clement said, "the proud ones are the hardest." "Yes. Also the best," Rodrigo said, and then they were quiet for the rest of the ride. The pipeline was finished by the middle of May. Clement had made sure it took longer than strictly necessary, which was not something he had ever done before in his professional life, and which he recognized, with a certain wry self-awareness, as evidence that Pearl Keller had done something significant to him. With the pipeline complete, the legitimate reason for his presence on her property was gone, and for 2 weeks he stayed on his own side of the fence and felt the absence of her like a change in the weather. The cameo brooch sat on his mantelpiece. He had not thought through what to do with it when he bought it back from Prairie. He only knew that he could not leave it there for some stranger to buy. And now it sat on his mantelpiece and looked at him, and he thought about how to return it to her in a way that would not be taken as either pity or something more presumptuous than he had any right to be. He was still thinking about this on the morning of the last Saturday in May when Rodrigo rode up to the house with an expression that meant something had gone wrong. "Fire," Rodrigo said, and then, before Clement's heart could do what it was already doing, he added, "Not our land, the widow's property, the east field." Clement was on his horse before Rodrigo finished the sentence. The fire was not large yet. A small one, started from what would later turn out to be a spark from the chimney landing in the dry grass at the edge of her planted field. She was already fighting it when he arrived, using a wet burlap sack to beat at the edge of the flames, and 2 of her neighbors from down the road were coming up behind him, and between all of them they had it out in 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like a much longer time. When it was over, they stood in the blackened grass and Pearl stood with them, her face streaked with ash and her hands shaking very slightly in a way she was clearly working to control. The fire had taken a section of the planted field, not the largest section but real, visible, gone. It could have been worse. one of the neighbors said, which was true and was also the least useful possible thing to say. Pearl looked at the burned section. He watched her face go through something very fast, a crack in the composure that she sealed shut almost immediately, but he saw it. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for coming." When the neighbors left, she stood alone at the edge of the burned ground. Clement had not left. He was not sure she had noticed this yet. She noticed. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was close to exhausted, close to the edge of a thing she had been holding back for a long time. "It will reduce the yield," she said, "but it will not end the season. I'll replant what I can." "I know," he said. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was absolutely steady and absolutely not fine. He did something then that he had not planned. He took one step forward and said, "Pearl, you do not have to be fine for my benefit." She looked at him. He saw it again, that quality of looking straight through things, and this time what she was looking through was him, trying to find the angle, the hidden motive, the thing underneath the apparent kindness that was going to reveal itself as something else. She didn't find it because it wasn't there. What he saw happen in her face after that was the most careful, deliberate, terrifying thing he had ever watched a human being do. She let something down. Just slightly, just enough. Her shoulders dropped 1 degree, her chin dropped 1 degree. She said very quietly, "I'm so tired, Clement." It was the first time she had used his first name. He said, equally quietly, "I know." They stood in the burned field in the afternoon light and said nothing else for a while, and it was the most intimate conversation he had ever had with anyone. He did not stay long after that. He didn't want to push past the moment into something she wasn't ready for. He told her he would send Rodrigo with seed to replace what she'd lost, and before she could object he said, "From my own stock. I always keep more than I need, and it goes bad if I don't use it. This is waste prevention, not charity." He said it lightly, echoing the note about the food, and he saw the corner of her mouth move in a way that might have been the very beginning of a smile. He rode home and stood on his porch and thought about the way she had said his name. He sent Rodrigo with the seed the next morning. He also sent a brief, businesslike note that said he had consulted the almanac and believed there was sufficient growing time remaining for a partial replant to be viable, and listed 3 specific varieties that would mature fastest, and said nothing personal at all. This was, he had decided, the correct approach. What Pearl Keller needed was not romance. What she needed was someone who treated her as a capable person with a difficult problem, and helped her address the problem without making her feel diminished. The rest, if there was going to be a rest, could wait. She sent back a note that was equally businesslike, and said she had chosen the second variety he mentioned, that she had already checked the soil conditions, and that she would keep records of the replanted sections separately to evaluate yield comparison. It was a completely practical communication. He read it 4 times. Rodrigo, handing him the return note, kept his face admirably straight. June came in hot and dry, which was not unusual for Kansas, but was always stressful for anyone with crops in the ground. Clement's cattle were doing well, the water situation improved by the pipeline, his south herd putting on weight at a rate that satisfied him. He rode his fences, managed his men, kept his books, and thought about Pearl Keller with a regularity that had moved well beyond the occasional concern of a neighbor into something that was, if he was honest with himself, constitutive. She came to town on Saturdays for the market, and he arranged, without making it look arranged, to be in town on Saturdays. They talked. It was careful at first, businesslike, the easy language of adjacent landowners with practical concerns in common. She asked his opinion on the price of corn futures. He asked her about a crop rotation method he had read about and thought she might have experience with. She had, and her opinion was specific and intelligent and slightly at odds with the article he had read, and she explained why, and she was right. By the 3rd Saturday, he was looking forward to those conversations, the way he used to look forward to very little. By the 4th Saturday they had moved, without either of them explicitly deciding to standing closer together when they talked. Not close by any standard that anyone watching could remark on, but closer than the distance of people who were merely neighbors. On the fifth Saturday, she said, out of nowhere, while they were discussing the county's new road maintenance schedule, "I want to apologize for something." He looked at her. "For what?" "For being difficult," she said. "When you first offered the water easement, I knew it was a fair arrangement and I was ungracious about it." "You were not ungracious," he said. "You were careful." "There's a difference." She considered this. "I have had reasons to be careful." "I know." She looked at him with those gray eyes. "Do you?" "No." "Enough," he said. "I know enough to understand that the caution is earned and not a reflection of who you are underneath it." She was quiet for a moment. The street noise of the Saturday market moved around them, people and horses and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery and dust. "You're a strange man, Clement Wells," she said finally. "I've been told that," he said. "I don't mean it badly," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved again, more this time, more clearly a smile. His chest did something complicated. He thought about the brooch every day that month. It sat on his mantelpiece like a question that needed answering. He still had not found the right approach. Giving it back directly meant admitting he had gone to Prairie and bought it, which meant admitting he had known about her financial situation, which meant admitting he had been paying attention in ways that might feel like surveillance rather than care. The revelation itself needed to land correctly, or it would undo everything he had built. The solution came to him, as solutions sometimes do, by accident. Or rather, by Harlan Prairie. In early July, Clement was in the store when Harlan said, with the conversational malice of a man who traded in everyone's business equally, "I suppose Mrs. Keller will be looking to replace that cameo she sold in April, once the harvest comes in. If she can manage it." He sounded genuinely uncertain whether she could. Pearl was at the other end of the counter. She had not heard the remark, or had chosen not to indicate that she heard it. But Clement saw the smallest stiffening in her back, the way a person's body responds to being discussed, to having a private sacrifice made public, even in passing. He felt something sharp and protective rise in him. He waited until Harlan went to the back to fetch something from the stockroom. Then he crossed to where Pearl was standing and said very quietly, "I need to speak with you, not here, when you have a moment." She looked at him, read his expression, nodded. They met on the street outside 20 minutes later away from the store. He took the brooch out of his pocket and held it out to her. She stared at it. A long, still moment passed. He watched her understand it, watched her trace the logic from the brooch to Prairie's counter to Clement's hand. The calculation in her face shifted through several registers, recognition, then something that might have been shame, then something harder and more complicated. "You bought it back," she said, not a question. "Yes." "When?" "April, the morning after you sold it." She looked up from the brooch to his face. Why? He had thought about how to answer this for 3 months. He had prepared careful, practical, noncommittal answers. He had decided to attribute it to the brooch's obvious quality, or to some impulse he could shrug off. He had decided, in other words, to be cowardly about it. Standing in front of her, with her gray eyes on him and the brooch between them, he couldn't do it. "Because it was the last thing you had from before," he said. "And I could not stand the thought of it sitting in Harlan Prairie's case waiting to be sold to a stranger. And because he stopped, started again. Because you matter to me, Pearl, in a way that I have not been particularly good at knowing what to do about." The silence that followed was the longest of his life. She looked at the brooch, then at him, then at the brooch again. "This was my mother's," she said. Her voice was very controlled and very quiet. "I know," he said, "or I guessed it had that quality about it. I swore I wouldn't sell it, and then the bill was there and the seed was there and it was the only." She stopped. "You made the right choice," he said. "The land is what feeds you. The seed was necessary. You don't need to make me feel better about it. I'm not. I'm telling you what I actually believe, which is that you have shown more practical courage and more clear-headed intelligence in managing that farm than most men I have known have shown in a lifetime." She was looking at him now with an expression he had not seen from her before, something that was not the careful neutrality, not the watchful reserve, something that was, underneath everything else, very much wanting to trust him and very much afraid of what that meant. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "Why would you spend your money on my mother's brooch? What do you want from it?" "Nothing," he said. "Or rather, the only thing I would want is not something I have any right to ask for." She was very still. He held the brooch out more clearly, a simple offering. "Take it, Pearl. It belongs to you. It belonged to you before and it belongs to you now, and I don't want anything in return." She reached out and took it from his palm. Her fingers were calloused from the work, strong and careful, and they touched his hand in the transfer, just briefly. He felt it the same way he would feel a brand, precise and permanent and marking something. She looked down at the brooch in her hand. When she looked up, her eyes were very bright, and he understood that Pearl Keller, who had survived 2 brutal winters and a drought and bankruptcy and widowhood, and all the particular cruelties that a woman alone in the West absorbs, was very close to crying, and that she found this absolutely unacceptable, and that she was going to hold it back through sheer force of will. He said, "You don't have to say anything." She nodded. Then she said very precisely, "Thank you, Clement," and she pinned the brooch below her collar right where he had always seen it, and something went back into its proper place in the world. She looked up at him, and they stood in the street in the full Kansas summer, and she said, "You said the only thing you would want is not something you have any right to ask for. What did you mean by that?" He had not expected her to press it. He took a breath. "I meant that I would like to know you better, if that is something you would be willing to consider. Not," he chose his words carefully, "not as a matter of obligation or gratitude. Not because I have done any of the things I have done with that expectation, but because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, and I would like to stop finding excuses to be in your vicinity and simply be in your vicinity if you would permit it." Another silence, though this one was different from the previous ones. It had a different quality, warmer, less dangerous. "The water easement," she said. "Yes. And the food from the noon meal. The waste prevention." The corner of her mouth, both corners this time. A real smile, small and careful and genuinely warm. "And Rodrigo coming to fix my fence line after the storm, which you told me was a shared labor arrangement between neighbors. He had the grace to be slightly embarrassed. That was true, broadly speaking." "Broadly," she repeated, and there was something very close to laughter in her voice, though she didn't quite let it out. "Pearl," he said, "yes. Would you have supper with me, at the hotel dining room properly, this Saturday evening, on the terms I described?" She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her weigh it the way she weighed everything, with clear eyes and no sentimentality. He saw her come to the end of the weighing. "Yes," she said, "I would." They had supper that Saturday, and it was the longest conversation he had had with anyone in years. She talked about her father, about the schoolroom in St. Louis, and the wall of books that she had grown up measuring herself against, about what it had meant to lose that world and find herself in a completely different one. He talked about the Kishom Trail, about what the land looked like before the fences came, about his father's hands, which had been the most competent hands he had ever seen on a man, and which he had tried to emulate his entire life. They talked about the future of Kansas, about whether the railroad was going to change everything again, about crop prices and weather patterns and the particular loneliness of the prairie. They did not talk about forbidden feelings or dark secrets or any of the charged things that sat beneath the surface of the conversation, but those things were there, present in every careful exchange, making the ordinary words carry more weight than words usually carry. He walked her to the livery where her horse was stabled and said good night in the street. She offered her hand, which was the formal gesture, and he took it, and held it a half-second longer than the formal gesture required. "Good night, Clement," she said. "Good night, Pearl." He rode home feeling like a man who has been standing on the edge of something for a very long time and has finally, carefully, begun the step. The summer harvest came in better than either of them had dared to hope. The Kansas summer was brutal in its heat but not in its dryness, and the rains came at approximately the right intervals for the first time in 3 years, and Pearl's yield on the replanted section was nearly as strong as the undamaged portion, a fact that she shared with him in a letter that was still businesslike but was signed Pearl, without the formality of her surname, which was new. He had begun riding over to her property on Sunday afternoons, not for any stated reason, simply because she had indicated when he asked that Sundays were her quieter days, and that she did not object to company in the late afternoon when the work was less demanding. He would arrive around 4 o'clock and she would bring lemonade, which she made herself and which was very tart, and they would sit on her porch and talk until the light went gold and long. He loved those Sunday afternoons with a completeness that he had not expected, because he had not known, before Pearl, that he was a man who needed to talk. He had considered himself self-sufficient in all the ways that mattered. But talking to her was like a door opening in a room he had thought was solid wall. She was funny, which he had suspected but not known for certain. Dry and precise and occasionally devastating, with a sense of absurdity that surfaced when she was comfortable. She had opinions about everything and was always able to defend them, and occasionally changed them when he made a good enough argument, which she acknowledged with a directness that he found enormously refreshing after years of people who either agreed with him because he had money or disagreed with him because they wanted to prove they could. He fell more thoroughly in love with her every Sunday afternoon, and it was not a comfortable thing, falling in love at 31 with a woman you have been carefully not falling in love with for 2 years. It had a particular quality of inevitability, like watching a long fuse burn down. He knew where it was going. He just did not know when he would get there. In late August, a situation arose that forced his hand earlier than he had planned. There was a man named Garrett Boyle who had arrived in Caldwell in the spring, and had been buying up distressed properties in the county with a speed and efficiency that suggested someone behind him with significant capital. He was not violent, not overtly. He was simply the kind of man who could smell weakness the way certain animals can smell water, and he moved toward it with the focused patience of someone who has done this before and found it profitable. Boyle approached Pearl on a Wednesday morning at the market. Clement heard about it from Rodrigo, who had heard it from the woman who ran the bakery, who had seen it directly. Boyle had offered to buy Pearl's property, the whole 160 acres, at a price that was below market value but not outrageously so, the kind of offer designed to look reasonable to someone desperate enough that reasonable looked like rescue. He also, according to the bakery owner, who had very good hearing and did not mind using it, told Pearl that he had spoken to the bank manager, and that the manager had indicated the current mortgage situation was unlikely to be sustainable past the end of the year. This last part sent a cold blade of anger through Clement when he heard it, because it was the kind of thing that might or might not be true, and was absolutely designed to frighten someone who was already frightened. He rode to Pearl's property that evening, not Sunday, a Wednesday, unannounced, which he had not done before. She was in the kitchen when he knocked, and she came to the door and looked at him with an expression that told him she had been expecting someone to hear about the conversation, and she was, with that particular Pearl Keller precision, pre-annoyed about being treated as someone who needed rescuing. "I heard about Boyle," he said. "Of course you did," she said. She stepped aside. "Come in." He came in. Her kitchen was exactly what he would have expected, spare and clean, and arranged with intense practicality, with the exception of a shelf of books above the dry sink that were worn and much-read, and looked like the most loved things in the room. She poured coffee without being asked and set it in front of him and sat across the small table. "I did not accept his offer," she said. "Good. I did not accept it because it was a bad offer, not because of any sentiment about the land, though I have sentiment about the land. I want that to be clear. I made a financial decision." "I know you did." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He was right about the bank," she said in a different voice, quieter. The manager confirmed it. "If the harvest price comes in low, I will not make the winter payment. And if I miss the winter payment, you will not miss the winter payment," he said. She looked at him with a very specific expression, the one that meant she was about to tell him politely but firmly to stay out of her financial life. He held up one hand. "Listen to me," he said. "Your harvest is good, we both know that. The replanted section is coming in. If the corn price holds where it has been for the last 3 weeks, you will make the payment with a margin. I have been watching the same prices you've been watching, and I believe you are safe." She looked at him steadily. "And if the price drops," he took a breath, "then we will figure out what to do about that when it happens," he said. "But I do not believe it will drop sufficiently to endanger you, and I think Boyle is counting on you to be frightened enough that you accept his offer before your harvest proves him wrong." She was quiet for a long time. The evening light came through her window and caught the cameo at her collar, and he felt again, as he always did, that peculiar combination of rightness and wanting that had become the defining quality of his interior life. "You have thought about my finances more than is strictly appropriate for a neighbor," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because I care what happens to you." In a way that has been established, and I think we both understand at this point. Her expression softened in a way that it very rarely did. "Clement," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm simply telling you what I know to be true, which is that Boyle is wrong about your situation and you should not let him tell you otherwise." She nodded slowly. Then she said in a voice that was very deliberate, "I am glad you came tonight." That was not small. From Pearl Keller, that was not small at all. Garrett Boyle came back twice more before the harvest was done. Pearl turned him away both times, with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. Clement heard about each visit and did not intervene, because Pearl did not need him to intervene, and she would rightly resent him for suggesting she did. But he was present in other ways, visible ways, the kind that communicated without requiring explicit statement that Pearl Keller was not a woman who was navigating this alone. The harvest was brought in during the first 2 weeks of September, and it was the best yield her property had produced since Thomas Keller had filed his claim. She told Clement this on the first Sunday afternoon in October, sitting on her porch in the early fall light, the prairie going brown and gold around them, her voice carrying the calm satisfaction of someone who has earned what they have. "The payment is made?" he asked. "The payment is made," she said, "and there is a margin." She paused. "A small one, but it exists." He looked at her. The evening light was in her face and the cameo was at her collar, and she looked like someone who has come through something and knows it, who is standing on the other side of a thing they were not sure they would survive. "Pearl," he said. She turned to look at him. Something in his voice had given him away. He saw her read it. He said, "I have to tell you something, and I want to say it clearly rather than continue to say it only in actions, because I think you deserve to hear it in words." She put her coffee cup down on the porch rail and gave him her full attention. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you for a long time, and I have tried to behave in a way that respects your independence and your judgment and your right to determine your own life. I am not asking you to change anything about what you are doing or who you are. I am simply telling you that I love you because I believe you should know it." A long, warm silence settled between them. Pearl looked at the horizon for a moment, at the long flat line of the prairie going gold in the evening light. Then she looked at him, and her expression was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen from her, open in a way that she very rarely permitted herself to be. "I have been in love with you since June," she said, as if this were a fact she had been carrying carefully and was now setting down. "Possibly earlier. I was not willing to admit it to myself because I was not sure I could afford to be." He was very still. "What changed?" "The brooch," she said simply. "When you gave me back my mother's brooch and asked for nothing in return, I understood that you were not Thomas, and that being afraid to love someone again was not the same as being wise." She paused. "I had confused the two things for a very long time." He reached over and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so deliberately, not in passing, not in greeting. She let him. Her fingers closed around his, those strong, calloused, capable fingers, and he felt the same as he had in the street in July, marked by something permanent. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "that you should refuse if it is not what you want. I am asking it because I want to, not because I expect any particular answer, and your answer will not change." "Clement," she said. "Yes, ask the question." He turned to face her fully. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment with those clear gray eyes, and he thought of everything they contained: the hard years, the careful pride, the intelligence, the humor, the capacity for love that she had spent so long protecting. And he thought of the brooch and the burned field and the Sunday afternoons and the way she said his name, which was always, from the beginning, different from how anyone else said it. "Yes," she said, "I will." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on her porch in the October evening and watched the Kansas sky go purple and then dark above the land they would tend together. They were married in December of 1878 in the Caldwell Church, with Rodrigo Esperanza as Clement's witness and the woman who ran the bakery, whose name was Dorothy Finch, as Pearls. It was a quiet ceremony, not small in the ways that mattered, but without the extravagance that neither of them wanted or needed. Pearl wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, and she wore her mother's cameo at her collar. And Clement looked at her when she came down the aisle and felt the same thing he had felt standing in the burned field in June, which was that nothing in his life before this woman had been quite complete. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Clement kissed his bride in the clear December light, and Dorothy Finch cried with great enthusiasm, and Rodrigo kept his face admirably straight until the moment Pearl turned and smiled at him, at which point he lost the battle entirely and beamed. They spent the winter together in the practical, intimate, surprisingly joyful business of combining two lives. Pearl moved her books to Clement's house, which immediately made it feel like a different place, and her kitchen garden plans expanded to a full diagram of the spring planting that covered the kitchen table for the entire month of February. They argued about the garden twice, mildly, in the specific way of two people who are both opinionated and in love, and resolved both arguments to their mutual satisfaction by the method of each of them being right about one thing. In the spring they combined their properties formally, Clement absorbing Pearl's mortgage into the ranch's finances and paying it down in full within the year, and they planted the larger fields together with a strategy that Pearl had been developing all winter and that Clement's experience in soil management helped to refine. They were good together in that way, their knowledge fitting together rather than competing, each one strengthening what the other knew. Garrett Boyle, who had been circling the county with his acquisition scheme, ran into a significant difficulty when the man backing him turned out to be involved in a land fraud case that came to the attention of federal authorities. Boyle left Caldwell in the spring under circumstances that the community discussed for years afterward. His departure was, in every way, satisfying. The first summer of their marriage was the driest in recent memory, but they had prepared for it. The pipeline extended now across a larger section. The water management that Pearl had been developing applied across both properties. They lost some cattle to the heat, which was painful, but not enough to damage the herd materially. The crops came in shorter than the previous year, but sufficient. They were learning together what it meant to tend something with two sets of hands instead of one. That October, Pearl told him she was expecting. He was standing at the kitchen table when she said it, looking at the ranch accounts, and he set down his pen and turned and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to Dorothy Finch as entirely undone, which was accurate. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her with something that was past happiness. That was the particular quality of gratitude that arrives when life gives you more than you understood you were asking for. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling? What do you need?" She put her hands over his and said, "I am excellent, Clement. I am not fragile." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I know that better than anyone. I am asking what you need because I want to give it to you, not because I think you cannot manage without me." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned her head and pressed her lips to his palm in a gesture so quiet and complete that it said more than a speech would have. "What I need," she said, "is for you to continue being exactly who you are." Their son was born in June of 1880, during the longest day of the year, in the kind of summer dawn that turns the Kansas prairie gold before the heat arrives. He was large and loud and had Pearl's gray eyes and Clement's dark hair, and they named him William Thomas Wells, William for Clement's father and Thomas for the man whose difficult legacy had brought Pearl to Kansas, and whose land had become, in the end, the foundation of something he had not managed to build himself. Clement held his son for the first time in the morning light and thought about everything that had led here. The cameo brooch on Harlan Pruitt's counter, the burned field, the Sunday afternoons. The way she had said, "I am so tired, Clement," and let something down, just barely, just enough to let him in. Pearl, recovering in the big bed with the window open to the morning air, watched him hold the baby with that same expression she had first seen in December, entirely undone, and felt something she had not believed in for a long time, which was that the future was going to be all right. Not perfect, not easy, not without the difficulty that life on the Kansas plains always involved, but all right, more than all right. Dorothy Finch came to help for the first 2 weeks and bossed everyone, including Clement, with magnificent efficiency, and Rodrigo Esperanza came with his wife Maria to see the baby, and stood in the doorway of the bedroom with a gentleness that suggested this large, capable, laconic man had a great deal of feeling he kept for private occasions. "He looks like a rancher," Rodrigo told Clement solemnly. "He's 2 weeks old," Clement said. "Even so." William grew into a large, cheerful, curious boy who followed both his parents around with equal devotion and demonstrated, by the age of 3, that he had inherited his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness in equal and formidable measure. He also inherited Pearl's love of books, which she had begun reading to him before he was old enough to understand words, her voice in the evenings carrying the same stories across the lamplit room that her own mother's voice had carried across a different room in a different world. The farm and the ranch continued to expand, carefully, thoughtfully, in the way that Pearl and Clement did everything, with attention to what the land could sustain and what their labor could manage. They hired 2 additional hands in 1881, a young man named Jesse who had come up from Texas with the last of the long cattle drives, and a quiet, serious man named August who had been farming in Nebraska and wanted to go somewhere warmer. Both men became part of the life of the ranch in the way that people become part of things when the people running it are fair and clear and treat labor with respect. There was a second child in 1882, a girl they named Clara, after Pearl's mother. She arrived in March, fierce and decided from her first breath, with Clement's coloring and Pearl's expression, which was to say that Clara Wells arrived in the world already giving the impression that she had assessed it thoroughly, and found it acceptable but had some specific improvements to recommend. William, who was 2 and greatly invested in his own importance, regarded his sister with initial skepticism, and within 1 week was completely devoted to her, which set the pattern for the rest of their lives. The community around them changed in the years that followed. Caldwell grew. The railroad brought new settlers and new commerce and new complexity. The Cherokee Strip, which had been the hunting ground of nations, and then the open range, and then the homestead territory, was open to settlement in 1893 in the Great Land Run, and the world that Clement had known as a young man driving cattle up the trail became entirely, irrevocably something else. He and Pearl stood on their porch in September of 1893 and watched the distant dust of the land run from across the hills and talked about it the way they talked about everything, honestly and without pretending it was simple. The land had always belonged to someone before it belonged to whoever held it now. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the Kiowa and the Cherokee had lived and died on the grass that grew under their feet, and that was a true thing that the law of the United States had tried its best to make irrelevant and had not succeeded because truth is not subject to legislation. "What will it look like?" Pearl asked. "In another 20 years. Different," he said. "Completely different. Better," he thought about it honestly. "For some people," he said. "Worse for others. The same as it has always been." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the dust settle over the distant hills, and thought about the future in the particular way of people who have made peace with not controlling it. In 1895, William Wells, who was 15 years old and had his mother's precise intelligence and his father's love of the land, announced that he intended to study agriculture at the State College when he was old enough. A plan that Pearl received with visible satisfaction and Clement with pride that he expressed by immediately looking into the cost of enrollment and the available scholarship programs. Clara, 13, announced that she intended to study law, which produced a brief silence in the kitchen followed by Pearl saying, in a voice of perfect calm, "That is an excellent idea. Women have been practicing law in Kansas since 1869. You will need very good marks in your studies." Clement, who had learned many things about his wife in 17 years of marriage, recognized this as one of the moments he loved best, her absolute refusal to limit her children's vision of what was possible. "Did you always want to be a farmer?" William asked his mother one evening, in the direct way of 15-year-olds who have not yet learned to be indirect. Pearl considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "I wanted to be a teacher when I was young, and then life gave me different circumstances and I had to decide whether to fight what I had been given or to become very good at it." "And which did you do?" she smiled. "Both," she said. "I fought it for a while and then I became very good at it." And then she glanced across the room at Clement, who was pretending to read the agricultural journal he held but was listening entirely. "I realized that what I had been given was not a lesser thing than what I had wanted. It was simply a different thing, and it contained more than I had known to want." Clement put down the journal and looked at her over the lamp. She looked back at him, those gray eyes, the cameo at her collar, silver now threaded into her dark hair and not making her less beautiful to him but more, the way things become more beautiful when you understand what they have been through. He said across the room, across 20 years of Sunday afternoons and burned fields and seed bills, and the particular weight of a brooch returned. "Pearl," she said, "I know." Their life was not a story about one dramatic rescue, though it had contained that. It was not a story about one grand gesture, though that too. It was a story about two people who had both been taught by difficulty to be careful, who had both carried dark histories of loss and forced choices and hidden griefs, who had both survived by learning not to need anyone too much, and who had found each other anyway and chosen, very deliberately, to need each other as much as the truth required. It was a story about a cameo brooch on a counter that was supposed to be just a transaction, and became instead the moment a man understood what he felt. It was a story about a woman who had sold the last thing she loved to buy seeds, which was not a defeat but a choice, the same fierce, clear-eyed, necessary choice she had been making since she arrived in Kansas with nothing but her intelligence and her will. In the spring of 1897, Pearl planted the northeast field with a new variety of wheat she had been corresponding with an agricultural researcher about for 2 years. Clement stood at the fence watching her walk the rows and thought, as he had thought many times, that he had never seen anyone as fully inhabited in their own life as she was in that moment, as fully present in the thing they were building together. He climbed over the fence and walked to her, and she looked up from the furrow she was examining with her hand in the soil. The prairie sun was in her face, and the cameo was at her collar, and her eyes were clear and gray and entirely present. "Good planting?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "This variety holds better in dry conditions. I think it will do well here." He stood beside her and they looked at the planted field together, this land that had been Thomas Keller's reckless dream and Pearl's desperate survival, and had become, through years of careful tending, something that belonged entirely to the future they were still building. He put his hand out. She took it as she had taken it on her porch 18 years ago, fingers closing with that strong, certain grip that was entirely pearl. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. And then, with that specific quality of warmth that she had learned over the years to let show without guarding it, "I love you too, always." They stood in the spring field with their hands together and the sky enormous and blue above them, and all the years ahead still waiting to be planted and harvested and tended and lived. The wind moved through the new grass and the prairie smelled of earth and rain and the particular clean possibility of a season beginning. Their life was here. Their life was this. The land and the love and the long work of building something that would outlast them and carry their names forward into a future they could not see but had, in every seed and every year and every chosen morning, given their best effort to make good. And it was more than enough. It was, in every way that a life can be measured, exactly what they had made it and exactly what they deserved.